There we go. That should do
yeah.
it. Yeah, brilliant. Oh, so welcome, guys, and welcome everybody, all of you watching out there. Today, I am really delighted once again because I have got my colleagues Alosa and Emma, and we've got our guest Ian Wood back. So that's brilliant. Thank you guys for your time once again, and thank you, Ian, for joining us so graciously, giving your time once again to just come and talk about mental health. And today we thought we'd cover the subject of generalized anxiety disorder, but just general anxiety anyway, and it's a massive subject, isn't it? So well, I was just saying to you guys earlier, like I've been wondering and just thinking about this idea of generalized anxiety, and I thought about my daughter, and I hope she's not watching, because she don't mind me saying this, I don't think, but yeah, I was just thinking about temperament, and how is it hereditary? Because I know in my family we've got anxiety, and I know when my daughter was born she had colic, and she's always been a slight warrior, I would say, and slightly adverse to risk maybe, and quite high conscientiousness. So I did wonder about this idea of hereditary. Is it hereditary? Do we model it? Is it behavior that they've learned, or is it in the environment, or is it what is the basis for it, and what causes it? I have all these questions. So Ian, can I ask you if you could just help us to understand, where does this generalized anxiety come from?
Well, I think all of those things are responsible for what we label as anxiety.
Yes.
Again, when it comes to talking about the kind of science behind these things, I think it's always a safe bet to always err on the side of caution. So yes, hereditary, possibly, societal factors, upbringing, parenting, environmental factors, all those things, yeah, absolutely. But there's no sort of concrete evidence to support any of them. So I think it's always easier to just accept that all of those things play their part at the end of the day.
Yes.
So we call it generalized anxiety disorder. And again, it's probably one of those definitions that confuses people, but it's one of those labels, again, that captures quite a broad broad base of factors when it comes to young people. So it's generalized because it's a form of anxiety that kind of affects everything about a person's life. There doesn't seem to be any specific thing. Some of the labels that we call anxiety tend to be around specifics. So phobias fall into that category. So somebody can be scared of mice, or they could be scared of heights, they could be scared of going to school. So there's very definite triggers. General anxiety disorder sometimes starts with those things, but then spills into other areas as well. So it's a word that we kind of use to capture a complexity of symptoms, really. I hope that kind of answers the question as best as it can.
Yes, no, that's so interesting. And as you were saying that, I was just thinking, sometimes we work with people and we always think, well, maybe there was an event in the past that has brought this on. Maybe was there trauma or something. But sometimes, like you were saying, so good, there just sometimes is no explanation. And I guess it's not like a trauma or a phobia or always some triggering event necessarily in the past. However, there might be a trigger in the present that just suddenly brings it on, or they're sitting on a bus and suddenly they feel this like overwhelming sense of absolute dread. But yeah, certainly that's been my experience. There is not always a specific trauma or reason, and I think this is what makes me a bit like, because I guess we're always looking for a reason, aren't we? Why somebody should feel like that. I don't know, is it just me? I always think, well, yeah, but sometimes there isn't a reason, and that just blows my mind a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I think sometimes in my experience of working with young people, and you'll find it too, is there might be things that the young person often says, well, this is why.
Yeah.
Sometimes there is a cause. An example just off the top of it might be that somebody feels that their friends are ignoring them more. So they're starting to say, it must be me. But then they're starting to look out into the world to look for evidence to support that. So then that evidence might be seen elsewhere. So it might be, my friends don't like me. oh, somebody else doesn't like me. Oh, I don't feel very good today. My teachers are getting on me. And it becomes that kind of snowball effect. It kind of rolls into other areas of the life. So it's that, again, I've mentioned this before, but there's this idea of what we call distorted thinking or interpretation. So somebody will start to feel that the world's against them, and they'll look for it and find it more often than not.
So true, so true. No, that is so true. And there's all this what ifs, isn't there? Like this fear of, I mean, so often they'll say, oh, but what if this and what if that? And I know even I used to be a warrior, and I'll hold my hands up. I used to be, before the world of counseling and before I had my own therapy and whatever, I was always worrying and always thinking what if. And I think that's so true. I see it in clients now, like, what if this, what if that? And sometimes it doesn't even make sense. It's not even logical. It's not always logical, is it? Yeah, it can be such an illogical and yet such a real physical behavioral impacts on every area of our lives. And it's not just worry. I mean, we all have worries. It's like what you were saying last time. I thought it was so good. That worry is actually a positive thing. And I know for me, it can motivate me sometimes, but then it becomes so debilitating on the other hand for people, doesn't it?
And I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
regards to things like sort of upbringing, hereditary, I think both Emma and Alosa might be more qualified to talk about that than me in that respect. But I think one real key message as well, before we get into a really big discussion, is it feels very real to the person that's going through it. So when I talk about misinterpretations of sort of events, yes, as the observer, we can see that that person is maybe being illogical or irrational, but to them it's very, very real. And I think that's one thing that I always bring to working with anxiety is it might not always make sense, but if you're feeling it and thinking it, then you're going through it, you're living it. So yeah.
Oh, and it can be so debilitating for that person. And I think that's why it can be so lonely as well, because you think, well, I must be the only person that this is happening to, and why am I so different? So it is very alienating at times. It can feel like you're very alone in it. And there's something about so important with us therapists, isn't there, being non-judgmental as well, because we understand that it can feel so shaming for people when they're struggling with something. They think, oh well, my mates aren't, life is easy for them, it must be all, it's me. So it can be very lonely, I think, sometimes if you're suffering from anxiety. Absolutely, such a good point. Yeah, and what is your experience, Alosa, with your clients, and Emma, what do you guys, what are your sort of thoughts?
Yeah, I'm just thinking now, I mean, both me and Emma actually are relationally trained counsellors and therapists. So we often tend to think a lot of it about how it is in the relationship. So almost like you're never just you on your own. It's always, whether it's back in history or in the present or looking ahead, things are always about you in relationship to the other person.
Right.
And I think it's really, I'm picking up on a few things like you and Ian were talking about there, and about how there's not general anxiety, it's never something specific. And I think it's often, you can be in a room, I can be in a room with someone, and you're thinking, like you were saying, Natalie, what is it, what what's the root things here? But there isn't anything specific, which is almost more traumatic for the young person, because they can't think, well, what is, I haven't suffered. I mean, I've seen young people and they say, well, no, I've not suffered any trauma in my life, because they're thinking about trauma in the sense of, abuse, physical or, domestic violence in their family, or kind of sexual abuse, or something that we would see as, yes, that's really traumatic. But often it's those what we would call relational traumas that are often things, how the trauma that's felt in contact and relationship with others that can create that anxiety. So that's, I guess, when you think about, we talk about attachment issues, but I think attachment is very much applicable to all of us. And lots of us, it's not that we might have issues that always make us make people anxious or whatever. We have styles as well, and it can be like we all have different attachment styles, and those can make us more anxious. You know, can I trust another person? Have I been brought up that I can trust other people? Have I been brought up that the world is a trusting place? So it's often that how we relate to others and to the world out there. Is the world a place to be trusted? Are challenges to embrace? Is there a risky, you know, is taking risks an exciting thing, or is it a really you know, and all these things, I'm a big believer in continuums, you know, so you're not, everybody's somewhere on it somewhere, you know what I mean? It's like a scale. So yeah, I think that big thing about, can you trust the world? And I really like that the transactional analysis theory, that TA theories that talks about belief systems. So how we're from early upbringing, we have kind of script beliefs, and we can just follow our script, and that script might be, well, do not trust the world, and the world, other people are out to get you. And so, like you were saying, Ian, you're always going to be looking for your script to be confirmed. So it's often why we wonder, well, why do people often seek difficult situations with others? Why do you know, why do they put themselves in certain relationships that don't feel right? And it couldn't be, well, they're trying, you know, it's a confirmation of their script for them, that those people confirm those innate sort of beliefs that they've been instilled or grown. I mean, it's a difficult thing because it's quite, and in theory, it's described as quite a subtle thing. I mean, I know TA talks about drivers, so like you were saying about be perfect, or
Yes.
you know, even drivers as subtle as don't be or don't exist, don't kind of, you know, and these can be communicated to children right early on, not in language, but those things create that anxiety then, that a teenager who's 16, 17 can't say why they're anxious, because it's something that's so innate in them that's just how it is, that's how the world is, that's how I am, that's how other people will be to me. I mean, I've had people in the room with me who have been so caught up in maybe the anxiety in relation to others that it's almost like their other family member is in the room with them, or they're going to be saying, you know, so that attachment of such a closeness that I'm anxious just talking about that. They could me. What if they hear what I'm talking about? Yeah, so I think there's something here about beliefs running right from an early, you know, and then challenging those, as you know, you're talking about that challenging, and that's often our kind of work, and it can take a long time, I think. And that's you know, you were saying, Natalie, you wonder sometimes, well, what's the reason, or what's, then you can go through a period often working with a young person and you don't find anything, but then it's like, well, actually it's very much of it's about belief, and you start working with that, and you've got to start challenging, and it's hard to reflect those things often to young people. I can think you're believing that this is how the world is, or this is how and I think that's sometimes why at Noah's Ark, or with some people, we work in that long-term way, because it's quite these things are quite entrenched, take a lot of challenging, a lot of these beliefs that are instilled. So yeah, I'm sure I could see you nodding away, Emma, in your relational way. Yeah.
Oh, Alosa, but you know what you said there, it just so jam-packed with such good stuff, and I think you're absolutely right. I mean, there is this, I love Dan Siegel, I don't know if you've ever, but I love Dan Siegel, and he says, you know, the what does he say, the neurons that fire together wire together. And I do think there is something about the early attachment, like you say, and how we're shaped and formed, and even the hereditary stuff, or the generational stuff, because I know, like in my family line, we've got anxiety right the way through, you know. And I just think about even things like we say to kids, and it's not because we, you know, that as a parent you necessarily obviously you want to keep your children safe, but sometimes we can communicate, like, I remember when I was a kid, like, oh, don't go up the slide, you're going to fall, or be careful, or, you know, all those, we don't think, we just want to keep our kids safe. We don't always think that actually we're maybe,
you must wait for the others, or kind of,
yes,
you know, those little things that send
so
messages
true.
around what that young person's place is in relation. Should they be the follower? Should they be the, some of the, you know, but then some of it's temperament as well, I think, Natalie, like you were saying, it's, you know, it is a mixture of things. It's not just parenting and how you've kind of, you've done that attachment with your children. There's, you know, there's so much more involved as well.
So good, Losa. And Emma, I've been really looking forward to asking you how do you work with the kids that you work with, you know, on the spectrum and that, because I'm thinking they must be so anxious anyway, like, just the world is such a not safe place so often for them. So yeah, tell us about your children and how you, what your
there's so much anxiety within the children on the autism spectrum. I think a lot of it for them is inbuilt. It's all the sensory needs that they've got. Everything's very overwhelming for them. It can be things that we hear at a normal level is so much louder to them. It's the touch for them is overwhelming. Smell, everything for them it's as if everything's just coming at them at once, and that's really anxiety provoking for them, things like that. But as well, they're often very aware that they're different as well, and that they don't make friendships as easily as other children often, and they feel like they don't really have their place a lot of the time. And I think a lot of it, just like anybody with quite high anxiety, a lot of it's interlinked with their self-worth and their self-esteem, and their finding themselves and being sort of proud of who they are, really. And a lot of the work that I do with them is surrounding that, getting them to think of the positives about themselves and the positives of having autism as well, and the good points of it, because there's loads of good points to being on the spectrum, and they just sometimes don't see it that way. And it's about working out how to just feel a little bit better about themselves. And the sensory stuff's still there, because it's part of it, it's part of what they've got, but it's working out how to manage it differently, and how to, often the work is with the world around them rather than with the child as well, to try and just make it easier for them, to try and dampen down all those sensory things that bother them and that make it so anxiety provoking for them. So but it's really high anxiety with them.
Wow. And I can only imagine, Emma, but I love what you said there about, you know, the positives about being on the spectrum. I love that, you know, and just celebrating people's richness and difference and gifts. Absolutely. And their strengths. I love the strengths-based positive psychology, you know, because absolutely. We've all got gifts and strengths and things we can bring. We don't always think of it like that, do we? Because I was reading somewhere today, and just reminded me about this negativity bias. And, you know, I wanted to ask you about that. Like, what is this idea about negativity bias, and that, you know, that we tend to look at the negative things? Is that about safety, or have I understood it? Is it about safety or keeping ourselves safe?
Is that, were you speaking to me, Natalie? Sorry.
Yes. I was just saying about the negativity bias, and how we, I was reading today about how we tend to look at things in a negative way, and there's something about keeping ourselves safe in that. And a bit of I guess it's linked to the evolution of, you know, looking out for the danger and being sensitive to that. And I was just remembering what you said last time about the amygdala, and how that can be quite sensitive when we're teens anyway. And I wonder if you could just recap on that and just remind us about how the brain is wired and how that sort of feeds into anxiety.
Absolutely. Alosa mentioned the word innate, and
Yes.
we talk about anxiety as being something that's dangerous. It's a mental health condition. Yes, it can be, but we're all born with anxiety in our resource of emotions. And again, if you look very early on at what we call the normalised stages of anxiety, they make sense. So one of the first things that we're fearful of is separation from the person that gave birth to us,
Yes.
to people who are close. So if you look at very, very tiny babies, they cry when removed from the mother. It's just a natural reflex. And then as that child becomes more aware of the world around them and safer, there's things like stranger awareness comes in. So somebody new, again, they become scared, fearful, shy in most circumstances. Then the next sort of phase is that kind of, as the child sort of develops into those toddler years, it's fear of things like nighttime, the dark, monsters under the bed, thunder, lightning, all those kinds of things. Again, very naturalized, normal fears that we've all probably been through. Then there's the idea of when you get to school and you become a little bit more aware of the world around us, we ask questions of the world. So it might be that, you know, death's another question that's normal to ask about. So I'm not talking about bereavement, I'm talking about where do we go when we die?
Yes.
And there's the stories around the news that little people pick up on. So natural disasters, the infinity of space, how big is it, things like that. And at the moment we are living through the reality of a planet. So something quite catastrophic, effectively, that children pick up on. Then they start to evaluate, sort of later on in primary school, what the differences are between people. So right, wrong, good, bad, different races, different sexualities, all those kinds of things start to come into it. And then also the peer pressure stuff, am I good enough at my work at school?
Yes.
Again, we sometimes lose sight of the fact that children have to go through that. Again, I think Losa mentioned it, this idea of challenge seems to be something that we're trying, through our good work of addressing mental health and raising its profile, we're also slightly losing sight that children need to be pushed, need to be challenged, and need to be given a little bit of freedom. Then when they get to secondary school, on a normalised model, it is very much about body image and fitting in. Beliefs, again, as Lo said, crucial things in terms of the way that you see the reality of the world around you. A belief shapes your reality. If I believe all firemen are dangerous, that's a belief that I've been told, brought up with, then I'll be very scared of firemen, or I might attack them. But that becomes stuck, it becomes rigid, then the only way to overcome that, in my opinion, is it's very ingrained into things like identity. Who am I in the world? Who likes me? Who values me? It all plays into identity, beliefs, behaviours, and that's often impacted on by your environment. So yeah, it's going back to what you quickly said about negative beliefs.
Yes.
That kind of idea, you mentioned something called positive psychology. And again, for people that don't know positive psychology, it is very much that. It's rather than looking at the inhibitions of life, the things that stop us and hold us back, what we do is we look at the flip side, that we look at the successes in the world and try to respect and value those things. So a guy called Martin Seligman, who coined the phrase positive psychology, he was really keen to explore, why don't we celebrate success, positivity, and what can we do to better enable ourselves? And it's all around that well-being message. So rather than focusing on problems, the disease model, so somebody goes to somebody to get fixed, what we're trying to do is we're trying to raise young people with resources that enable stronger, more well-being focused beliefs, values. So rather than sort of saying to myself, school's rubbish, it's boring, because that's the script that everybody's given at school, why not say, what have I done today that's been useful and worthwhile? It's training the brain to see that. But this week is, if you can think yourself into a negative state, it's processes that are often doing that. So why not learn from that and use the same processes, but in reverse? Yeah.
I
So,
love that. Yes.
so I can waffle, but yes. So
No, that's so. You know, I love what you said there about, because there is something about we can reverse it. Because if you can go this way, you can go back. You can go back as well. And if you can think negatively, we can think positively. Like, we get so out of balance and get so problem focused, don't we?
it's exactly.
And actually, training the brain, I love that, because we have got neuroplasticity. So yeah, I mean, that's exciting to me that we can train the brain. You know.
It's like the same thinking that creates a problem that can uncreate a problem. It's hard to kind of get your head around, but that's all it is. It's thinking most of the time. And again, this cognitive behavioral therapy explores how the thinking process works. But sometimes we can go even a little bit deeper than that, and we can think, oh, what is thinking? Emotion. What is it that I'm doing that creates the problem in the first place? Because for a long time, we've been very focused on external factors. So there's things outside me that affect me. But what is it that you're doing that's allowing that affecting to take place? It's quite deep. But yeah, so if I think of something that makes me feel bad, there's a clue there in the sentence. I'm thinking something that gives me a feeling. What is it that I'm thinking about that's causing me to that feeling? And this is all taking place quite often in the present. So last week about the difference between fear and worry. So fear is usually being fearful of something taking place right now. Worry is the idea of it after the event or ahead of the event. So I can think today about something that's going to happen next week and get terrified of it and then be scared of it. But I thought that. So yeah, it's very much about trying to, we don't teach this stuff at schools, but teaching people about what thinking really is. And most of it's sensory. So when we talk about people on the autistic spectrum being highly impacted on sort of sensory values, and if autism causes an exaggeration or hypersensitivity, so you can imagine not only are they feeling frustrated, anxious, they're ramping it up because it must be affecting them in a much more profound way because the filters aren't there. So I shall speak.
All right, to just follow up.
So fascinating. Go on.
Yeah. No, I just wanted to really bring out the point as well that Ian was saying about that fixing, you know, it's not something to be fixed, because I think we're all part of services, well-being, mental health services, and this is what obviously we find all the time, that people want their young people fixed, whether that's parents, people in school. They feel, I often get the phrases of like, do your magic, Alosa, on there, and it's like, well, it's not like that. And I think there's something about that I'm hearing there from you, Ian, that importance of being self-aware. Okay. So the anxiety is there with us all, in that innate kind of, it's there as a tool. But if we can't capture, and I know CBT, I think, talks about a bit of capturing the thoughts, you know, but it's that self-awareness also of, well, I am in control. So there's something about the empowerment going along with the self-awareness of what happens when I think like this, and what, you know, because something like generalized anxiety, it's almost like people, whoever's got young people or adults, whoever, I feel people, they're still trying to gather that sense of self, aren't they? It's very, they are very much in that building up of self, the neurons and the pruning that you talked about before, you know, that happens in that teenage phase of getting rid of things. Neurons that have fired continuously in practice, they get kept, and the other ones get discarded. And sometimes that means if you've been worrying about stuff for years and years, well, you're still going to be worrying about it because you practiced at it. But so maybe that at that age of young people, it's a good age to kind of try and build some self-awareness there of what their patterns are, what their patterns of thinking, what their patterns of thinking about the world, their beliefs, their ideas about relationships, their ideas about trust. Because there's always a balance, isn't there? Trusting too much, trusting not enough, you know. Again, a spectrum. I love that continuum thing, being in balance. But yeah, I think there's something about that empowering, that idea of self-awareness, that nobody's here to be fixed. We're all individual human beings with things that trouble us, and maybe some people are more troubled by things, by the way that their brain and the way that they're feeling or processing things. But as they can become more self-aware of how that's happening, they've got more capability to challenge those kind of script beliefs or those patterns of thinking, in order to sort of steer them into a more positive, healthier mindset.
So true, so true. Because sometimes we are disturbed by what we think rather than what really is, isn't it? I know I have been at times. So it's so true. The power of thought and thinking. It's just mind-blowing, really. Yeah. No, it's so true. So true. You guys are saying such good things. I'm glad we're taping this. I might have to listen again. It's really so rich. But yeah, and Emma, you were just nodding your head, and just I can tell you're thinking about your kids as we're speaking. Yeah.
I was just thinking as well. There's that line of going up the age bracket of where you sort of, as you get older, get comfortable in that anxiety, that actually that's then becomes a familiar place for you, and it becomes a comfort, and then it's more difficult, like with everything you've said about it being more ingrained, it's also, it becomes part of who you are, doesn't it, and who part of your identity. And what am I without that anxiety? Where would I be without it? And when it sometimes does start to subside, that can be anxiety provoking in itself, can't it? Because then, what is this feeling? Why am I not anxious? What's going on now? And again, it's another sort of cycle, isn't it, that you get stuck in sometimes.
Yeah. Oh, Emma, that when you said that, I just thought, yeah, the labels that we can put on people sometimes, and the labels that kids grow up with, and they just like, well, I've always been a warrior, and it's just just get so, like you say, part of the identity. It makes me feel quite sad, actually. But I love the idea of positivity, and that we can change it. Like that's just because it's always been like that does not mean it always has to be like that. And we get stuck in that identity.
And it's again challenging those thoughts, isn't it? That actually this doesn't have to be a part of. I mean, obviously you're going to worry at some points. We've all got an anxiety in us. It's normal. It's human. And I think that's part of working with anxiety as well, as normalising it, and actually that if you're not anxious, sometimes that's when something's wrong as well. You've got to have some sort of level of anxiety, because you're a human being. That it's normal.
Yeah, and what I'm hearing is it's about balance, maybe, and about finding the balance. Yeah. And you smiling. What are your thoughts? What are you thinking?
Well, I think that's fantastic that Emma was saying that. Because you come across it so often, is that when somebody starts to work through their anxiety, and that anxiety starts to decrease, that actually then the next is why haven't I got that anymore? And then that, worrying about worrying. And
I like that, worrying about worry. Tell us about that. That's an interesting phrase.
That's almost the kind of the dictionary definition of anxiety, is worrying about worrying. When you asked me earlier on about sort of like the kind of science behind the stuff of anxiety, it is worth just spending a couple of minutes on that, because I believe personally that one of the best ways to overcome anxiety is to understand the process of anxiety. And it is one of those emotions that we can actually understand quite well, whereas other issues that are out there in our world are a little bit more tricky. But with anxiety, it's, when I work with young people, the first thing I do is I explain to them what actually takes place. So without repeating last week too much, there's this thing in the middle of the brain called the limbic system, and part of that is the amygdala. And we believe that the amygdala is the part that looks out for danger. It's always been a part of the human condition. And historically, if you think about how we've changed the way that we live our lives throughout history, there was probably a more reasonable excuse to have that lookout in the past, because we were surviving more in the world. So a few hundred years ago, it might be that you had to build your own house. Your family had to go and grow their own crops. And if they failed and your house failed, then you were in a sticky situation. There was also the threat of poverty, disease, hunger, war, all those things that have been with us for far longer than we've known today, because now we live in these wonderfully warm environments. Most of us have the luxury of an NHS service. We have a school for our children to go. We do have access to food all year round. And sometimes if things get really bad, then our society does try to look after itself. So the real threat that used to be out there that we lived our life through has been kind of fortunately settled. We don't need to worry so much about those very real dangers. But that very historically advanced part of our brain doesn't know that, is still working as if there's always in the environment. So that's where we start to worry about things that maybe aren't that significant when we look at it, but to the person it's a very big thing. It could be something simple for an adult, a brown envelope dropping through the letterbox demanding money that you don't have, and it's like, oh man. It could be driving to work in a hurry, dropping your kids off at school, being late for a meeting, having lots of other drivers around you. That aggression, that more kind of, again, innate sensation starts to emerge. So we become angry, we become aggressive. And that leads me back to that idea of fight, flight, and freeze. So just to recap, I always talk to young people about this lookout in the brain. So it's always there looking for danger regardless. So if somebody knocked a kind of drink over, I'd go to catch it. Or if something flew towards my face, the body tries to respond. It's there all the time. If somebody ran into the assembly room and blew an air horn, we'd all jump and react. Yeah. But that reaction then leads into the world of fight, flight, and freeze. Fight, flight, and freeze is obviously when we're presented with danger, we either choose to run away, we tend to become aggressive and run towards and get rid of it, or we run away in fear. There's the idea that it could be that years and years ago that if we were being hunted by animals, if we played dead and froze to the spot. There is another element of that called follow the crowd, which happens a lot as well. So if there's danger, we all tend to follow what everybody else is doing. But there's that process is a chemical process, in as much as we know that we're not always convinced that chemicals do affect the brain, but we do know with hormones, specifically adrenaline, noradrenaline, and cortisol, that they lead to that reaction. So our body produces these chemicals that are preparing our body for the risk that we're perceiving. So cortisol can put us in an agitated state. It can make us feel aggressive. So can noradrenaline. And that's the thing that ramps it up, but also explains that heart-pounding sensation. The other thing as well is that our body doesn't need to do a lot of things when we're in danger. So it doesn't need to digest food. It's going into that alert phase. It doesn't need to do very much in terms of our digestive system. So one of the things that we get when we're anxious is the need to go to the toilet more. That's why very young people wet themselves. When people are confronted with significant fear, they expel food, they vomit. So there's a very, very logical reason. Again, I can't emphasize this enough. Even though that's really unpleasant, that feeling of heart beating, that butterflies in the stomach, what we can tell ourselves is that our body is doing what it's supposed to do. It's keeping us safe. It's protecting us. So that doesn't necessarily make it go away, but it changes the frame, the perspective on that problem. Yeah. Of the other things about working with anxiety is it's the way that we frame things. So it's when we're presented with fear, we get this physical reaction. Reassure yourself that your body is doing its job. That's the main message. Yeah. Obviously, we want that to not happen so much because it is uncomfortable. But by trying to understand that as being unpleasant and there's something wrong with me, actually, no. All four of us, if we were presented with something very, very anxiety, we would all feel those feelings. It's normal.
That's so good, Ian. And there's something about helping, because as you said that, I just thought, oh gosh, that would put it so in perspective for me if I was a young person having to, deal with that. And I'd feel so much more in control once I understood what's going on with my body physiologically. Why am I having these sensations? Because it can be so frightening, and like you say, fear producing fear, and it's feeding on itself. That's so good, that psychoeducation, and so important. I'm so glad you said that. Absolutely important when we're dealing with anxiety in young people.
I had a young person that was, the parents were complaining that young person wasn't eating so well. And again, this is the fine line we have to tread. What can we do to support that young person? And we do try to look for whys and triggers and things like that. But one of the other side effects of anxiety is that not wanting to eat. And again, by focusing in on that, you need to eat more, you need to be we're worried about you, that then becomes a vicious cycle. So that raises anxiety. That's, again, it's that worrying about worrying. Anxiety is this perfect paradox. The more you try to think about the things that are worrying you, the more you get the feelings, then therefore those feelings cause more anxiety. It's just that perpetual loop.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. And it's so interesting once you understand it. But when you're in it, it's so hard to see the wood for the trees, isn't it? Yeah. Oh, so good. So good.
I'm just wondering, Emma, what you think in terms of that, because again, anxiety can often be just bigger than the individual. And so therefore you've got maybe this more, what we call a systemic model, where you've got a family's routine, their regime. Again, Alosa alluded to those scripts, those things of the past, or those things that we live within that cause and contribute to those feelings. So we might be thinking we're doing the right thing, but by doing the right thing, we're actually making more of it. Is it called enabling?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it is a lot bigger, isn't it, than just that one person. It's their whole system, it's their whole upbringing, their whole surroundings. But I think you're right when you, with the psychoeducation part of it, at least if that young person or that child understands what they're going through, it's sort of human nature, isn't it, to want to cling on to something, to cling on to a reason why we feel like this. I know, especially if it's a chemical thing, if it's a hormone thing, there'll be so many other reasons, but it's sometimes nice to, I've been anxious my whole life. I've always been anxious, very anxious person, and then I was diagnosed with a hormone disorder that gives me that anxious feeling, and it's not gone away, it's not going to go away, but I understand it now, and it's so much easier because I've got something to cling on to. And there'll be so many other things as well, which as well you understand, but having that thing to cling on to. But like you say, with families and the systems around it, it's getting the child to understand it, but also giving that education to the family so that they can change things to help that child, and to help, because it is sometimes bigger than what that child can change themselves. If it's a neurological thing, like with the autism spectrum and people on that it's not as easy to just, it's not as easy for them to do it. It's sometimes got to be that system that helps them and challenges their thoughts on things and challenges their way of being, and to create a new normal for them in terms of how they maybe live their lives a little bit, and how they react to that child, and what's their new normal, and challenging that. Yeah.
Oh, that's so good, so good. And Alosa, you were nodding. What were your thoughts around as we were talking?
I was just thinking of that systemic sort of that way in which we were blended through a little bit, and you were just saying how you can think, parents may think they're doing the right thing. Often it's parents who have gone through a lot of anxiety in their past, and they don't want their children and young people to go through anything like that or anything similar, and they want to protect them. But often that can create I think it's that syndrome of sort of that smothering sort of parenting sometimes can create that anxiety that the world isn't safe out there. You know, all those what ifs. Well, what if something happens to me at the bus stop, or and I think, as well intentional as that often is, that can be that systemic thing that actually I often like the phrase, well, whose anxiety is this? That's I often ask young people when they're talking about things that stress them out, or the anxiety that stresses them out. Well, in the syndrome, I say, who does that belong to? Do you want that anxiety? Almost like it's the hot potato that's come to them, you know, past them. Whose anxiety is this? They start to pick it out. Well, actually, it's not mine. I don't want it. It's somebody that belongs to my teacher, or that belongs to my mum or my brother or whoever. That actually isn't my anxiety. That's theirs, that they've transferred to me, and I've kind of absorbed it and I'm carrying it around.
It's true though, isn't it? We do. I think it is quite catchy, personally. Yeah.
I always like that. I always have that thought of like, well, whose anxiety actually is this? Whose is it?
That's so good. Yeah.
And I think as well, like you were saying, Alosa, those sort of families or parents that do everything they can to protect that child and do things for the child, and showing that maybe modelling that the world is a scary place, it reinforces that self-worth, doesn't it? And reinforces that I'm not good enough to do this by myself. I can't do this by myself because mum and dad have always done it for me, so therefore growing up I can't do it. Yeah.
Oh, do you know, that's such a good point, because we talk about resilience, don't we? And self-esteem linked to that as well, because it's nice to take a risk, and actually I took a risk and I got it and I did it, and it feels great. And then your esteem goes ooh, and then you want to take more risks, not like but just building that belief in your own resilience and capabilities is so good, and your self-esteem of course soars when and you get praise and positive feedback, and that's the making of a confident and resourceful and resilient child. But of course the parents will be, I'm thinking myself as a parent. I was such an anxious parent when I think back. I was quite young and I was full of anxiety, and I was probably like, oh, be careful, and I guess that gets me back to the beginning of this conversation, where does it come from, and I was thinking about then my parents, and I do think there is something about that. But at the same time, I have such empathy for parents that I talk to, because I think, well, they're good enough, they're doing the best they can, and their motives are so often, they just want to protect. So interesting though, isn't it? So interesting. So guys, I'm just aware of the time again, it's just flowing. Like, I can't believe how fast an hour can go when we talk like this. But just before we go, just can we leave with I guess, just as we always do, something about just thinking about professionals in schools, and obviously, and you work with a lot of schools as well, just thinking about what we can leave people and the thoughts we can leave them with, and how we can maybe keep people up to be able to help with, to support kids and young people that are going through this horrible generalized anxiety.
Obviously, with schools, wonderful thing about Calderdale is they've got access to free training on anxiety. So I recommend any school, obviously most schools do accept that offer, to get that sort of professional training. The other thing I think to schools, and again, the teachers listening, the school staff listening, probably not agree with this fully, but makes sense, is this idea of planning rather than reacting. So quite often, not just within schools, within professional environments, home life, we tend to react to problems whilst they're taking place and afterwards. But if somebody is presenting with anxiety and is quite open about it, or somebody's come and said we have a concern, then it's very much about, well, what can we do to try and alleviate that moving forward? So we need to put a lot of energy into this to make that things simpler moving forward. Because more often than not, as that problem increases for that young person, what you find, and we're finding more and more in schools, is those children becoming much more reluctant to participate in education, and it becomes quite a big deal. So again, I think it was Emma that said, it's that kind of, if we can get in there early, all this preventative work, fantastic. But we know that the world doesn't like that. But one of the things I always do in a school is sit down and say, what can we do over the next few weeks to put a plan into place for that young person? Because, and this is the bit where schools might see the sense, is that quite often it takes them a lot longer to deal with it as a reaction rather than it will be to put in place. So it's putting that time in first. Again, schools often say, well, there's no guarantee that that's going to pay off. Well, fine, but take the risk, because the risks are anyway, they're very real. The other thing as well is that, again, this idea that we've talked about enabling. We don't want to give children an excuse to not participate in the normal things of life. So last week, one of the things I said, where a problem becomes serious, is if it stops people going about their day-to-day business, and anxiety is all about that. So we don't want to separate children from their peers or from their educational. We need to build that resilience. And resilience is a process that can be taught. It's overcoming challenge. So life isn't easy. Hard work is hard. And sometimes we're uncomfortable. And a lot of young people might give up before they've even tried nowadays. And that's not a judgment. It's just what I witnessed. So one of the things is it's getting the children to recognise what have they been through in their life already that has been a challenge that's been met and overcome. And it's the little steps that a child needs to build that process of overcoming challenge, which leads to making yourself feel good. So something I did recently in my life is I did a course that was really difficult. Beforehand, I worried about it, was terrified of it, got those anxiety symptoms, did it, found it really difficult, but I got through it. And I am so pleased now that it's over, but also I pushed myself to do it. That then leads me to believe that I can do it again. Those feelings of doubt might crop up, but I did it last time and I know it was difficult. So therefore I can do it again, knowing how difficult it was. And that's a life lesson I think that we've all learned as adults, which children are still learning. Children have learned to walk, they've learned to talk, they've learned to ride bikes, they've fallen off and hurt themselves, but they've done it. So it's these little things that allow them to realise I can do that in the future. So yeah, that's my message, is try to overcome challenge.
I love that. I think I'm applauding that, because I just think there's something in about success just breeds success, doesn't it? And it breeds self-confidence, it breeds self-esteem. I love that. Absolutely. And oh, thank you, Ian. That's brilliant. And Eloisa, you're nodding. What were your sort of thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I would reiterate that that's absolutely what Ian was saying. And I think that planning is, that is that idea of that systemicness of they are presenting this anxiety in a system, and that system needs to plan to help them to see that they can get through it. And I think it is, I think these things are very much a relational thing, is my perspective. So they kind of, I think schools need to see it, not react to it as this person needs fixing sometimes, but see it as, well, how can we plan? We're in this system with this young person. How can we help them to be more resilient and go through this challenge, go through that challenge with them? And I think it does start. And I know at the moment, while we're speaking, schools are planning on opening up for like their early years children, and and these things start very early on. And I think the more I'm thinking about it, you can see the sense in government saying that these children need to go back to school, because they do need to have that sense of community and relationship and trust, even in as positive, distanced way as possible. And it may not be a whole heap of distance for your young children, but it's that the psychological damage that might come from being distant from others could be quite huge, actually, could be quite an impact for that early end. So I think there is something about maybe embracing that thought of, for young children, they do need to see the world as a safe place as well, because that actually, if you don't think people are generally pretty okay and aren't out to get you, and that the world is generally okay, you've got to have that certain sense of belief. And some people get that from religion and hope, and from all sorts of different things, spirituality, from but in essence, it's some of that, thinking about you have in counselling this okay corral kind of I'm okay. You need to feel like I'm okay and the other person's okay to be able to get through really life. If you don't think other people are okay or you don't think you're okay, there's a mismatch there, and it's trying to get that balance that actually together we do have the best interests, teacher and pupil, parent and young child, or whoever. We do actually want the best for each other, really. Your child wants to be attached to you, the teacher wants to help you, really. They just maybe don't know, but if you can think of the best of each other, that's maybe strike that balance.
Really, just quickly as a caveat, I really love schools. I think they do a fantastic job.
They do, under very difficult
circumstances
often, don't they? And they're rushed off their feet. They got up. I think, bless them, how do they do it? But absolutely. And as you were talking, Lois, I just thought it's so ironic that so much of our hurt comes from relationships, but yet so much of our healing can only be done in relationship. And isn't it ironic sometimes? Yeah. Oh, Emma, guys, you're just amazing. You're saying such amazing things. I like it, like you often do. You blow my mind, and I'm left with so many more questions rather than answers. But anyway, sorry, Emma, go on.
Basically, what everybody else has said, really, that to end, that just that empowerment of the young people and just getting them to believe that they can, and build, like you said, building that resilience and just being understanding, being kind, and empathizing with them. That it is horrible for them at that time, but empowering them to be able to get through it whilst not brushing it aside and saying pull yourself together. Do you know, it's that being in it together as well, like you say, building that relationship with that young person and letting them know that life's okay and that people are okay.
That's so good. And I also, like you say, Emma, that you don't have to, it doesn't often say this to young people, it doesn't have to be a life sentence, and feelings change, and the way you feel now, you won't recognize yourself in 6 months' time. People need hope, don't they? Because when you're in it, it feels like it is a life sentence. When you're in it, it can feel like that. Well, I think what you were saying earlier, Emma, about, once in the psychoeducation, and once you get more of an understanding of what's going on for you, feel more in control. It doesn't have to be a life sentence. It's not forever. And I would say just talk to somebody and, find that help, because there is help out there. There are so many lovely, wonderful services, and, there's just people do want to help. So yeah, guys, the time has just flown, but thank you once again. You've also graciously participated and given your time up. So yeah, really thankful, and I'm just blown away by the things you guys say. So thank you so very much. And stay safe, and to all of you out there, stay safe, and we'll see you next week. Take care now, guys. Bye.